Hey gamers, I've got a treat for you today. If you haven't heard, a beta patch is in the work for Celeste that provides numerous quality of life changes for speedrunners based largely on community feedback and requests. I've seen a few articles floating around the internet discussing this, so I figured it was a good idea to outline this in a short video so that everyone, including those who don't even run the game, can know what's going on. Developer intervention in speedrunning is a sticky subject, but in my personal opinion, I think I agree with or at least understand every single change made here. As far as I know, this is the last patch planned for the game, so it's a good opportunity to clean up some of the near objectively flawed parts of the game, so that runners don't have to deal with them potentially over a decade down the line. That aside, I'll mostly be leaving personal opinions out of this video, and hopefully this is a useful reference for anyone interested to use. Lastly, this will mostly just be covering what I think is relevant to speedrunning, but if you notice I missed something or even got something wrong, please feel free to leave a comment and mention it. The changelog for this patch is huge and spans several previous beta patches, which had numerous experimental changes that were removed, so keeping track of everything was quite difficult. The last thing I'll mention in this video before getting started is that this was somewhat of an experiment of creating a long, explanatory type video for me. You'll probably notice some weird cuts and changing audio quality here and there, but I was mostly just experimenting with recording and wanted to finish something in an afternoon. I tend to burn out of ideas in the scripting phase, so I wanted to have at least one small finished project under my belt to maybe motivate myself in the future to make something else. Basically, don't expect high budget production from this video, but if you're an expert at this sort of stuff and you notice some weird, really easy to fix issues with my audio quality, for example, please feel free to point them out in the comments. And with that out of the way, I hope this video is helpful to you. First of all, probably the biggest change the beta made. Control mapping has been massively overhauled, allowing for a lot more flexible bindings within the in-game control menu. The current patch of Celeste is weirdly restrictive on what it allows for bindings. Some buttons, such as arrow keys, were hard-coded to be certain actions. As well, for some reason, keyboard couldn't bind multiple jump buttons in-game. Practically all of these issues could be addressed by either editing your Celeste settings file or using a third-party program, such as AutoHotkey. But I would probably say that this was the biggest barrier of entry for new players coming into Celeste. This is what the new control menu looks like. Beyond addressing the issues just shown, many new things have been introduced. This includes binds specifically for menuing and movement, as well as binds specifically for dash directions. I'm unsure of any specific applications this would be useful for, but the option exists and I'm sure someone will find a use. If nothing else, more flexibility never hurts. I'll also mention now that the game has added an option for either invert or toggle grab. Invert grab makes it so that holding the grab button is a default action, and holding the grab button now makes you release grab. Having to constantly wave the grab button down can definitely be taxing on the hand, though I do think for a lot of veteran players there would be too much trouble in adapting to this. For newer players, this is definitely an appealing option though. Toggle grab, as you would imagine, turns grabbing into a toggle. Pressing the grab button will put an indicator above Madeline and she will always grab, and pressing the button again will remove the indicator and she will no longer grab. Again, more flexibility never hurts. Now for the most significant change. This binding menu has also added a crouching dash option, which in other words is a demo dash button. Demo dashing is a technique that allows for dashes in any direction except down to have a crouching hitbox, allowing for much tighter dashes, hypers from a horizontal dash, as well as numerous skips due to it allowing for Madeline to pass through hitboxes she wouldn't normally be able to. Binds for this existed previously and were extremely common, but could only be done outside of the in-game binding menu. This change has two significant consequences. First of all, this now means that demo dashes in any direction can be done easily with the press of one button, in particular upwards diagonal demo dashes. Demo dash binds previously only allowed for easy horizontal demo dashes, while diagonal demo dashes required either manually inputting the demo dash, which requires changing from down to up diagonal within 4 frames, or using one of the many binds that made the process much easier but had other limitations. This might seem like a pretty controversial change, but in general top players think this is a good idea. The inputs required for diagonal demo dashes could be really restrictively difficult for many players, and I think the skill ceiling of the game will somewhat paradoxically rise as a result of making them easier, as they now become more viable for all to use. This is basically exactly what happened with horizontal demo dash binds, thanks to discoveries like demo hypers. Personally, on current patch, my consistency level with these jumped from around 20% with manual redirecting to 95% after switching my method of performing them to a method that basically requires a third-party remapping program. This has never really sat right with me. I don't think the headache that this has added to the game has added that much depth to the gameplay. The second consequence, and why this bind was requested in the first place, is that this now allows for console players to have a demo dash button. Since they couldn't rely on editing settings files, console players were stuck with the in-game binding menu, which couldn't do demo dash binds. Console players could do them manually, but this made them really restrictive and near impossible to mix in with movement. This basically only allowed them to do them for time-saving skips, where they were basically required for a competitive time. This was probably the biggest disadvantage of playing on console outside of a lack of practice tools, so this change will be really helpful to them. Since I don't know where else to mention this, they also changed a few of the animations associated with crouching dashes to make it more clear that Madeline is crouching. In particular, extended hypers can look pretty weird now. This might take some getting used to, but it's a purely visual change. I wouldn't be surprised if this got reverted, though. A change was also made to how pausing works. The pause button was now given an input buffer window similar to every other action in the game. This now allows for really consistent and easy one-frame advancing pause buffers. The entire discussion of pause buffering in Celeste is a large rabbit hole that would add 10 minutes to this video. For a shortened version, on current patch, pause inputs have no buffer window associated, meaning that a one-frame advance for pauses requires a frame-perfect input, which defeats the point of pause buffering something difficult. The player, however, realized that you could instead accomplish this by binding literally a dozen or so pause inputs on keyboard, and you could keyboard smash during unpause lag to accomplish this one-frame advance, which this suddenly meant pause buffering was a viable technique for runs. Controller players were in a difficult situation since they simply didn't have enough buttons to be able to utilize this. So someone in response created a script that would bind all analog angles to pause buttons, so pause buffering could be accomplished by literally spinning an analog stick. Both cases are technically legal under current speedrunning rules, but are about as degenerate as they sound, and this led to a discussion as to whether pause buffering should be in the run. This led to basically two different discussions. Should pause buffering be legal if it's really obnoxious to perform? And should pause buffering be legal at all? By adding this pause buffer input, we can solve the first discussion. Pause buffering can now be done relatively easily with only one button and on any control scheme. With that solved, the speedrunning community will be having a discussion as to whether pause buffering should be legal at all in the run. It is worth repeating that this change does not necessarily mean pause buffering will be legal for speedruns. This will take time to work out, so if you want more information, including a very lengthy document and a few videos of noteworthy applications, check the video description. I suppose it's also worth mentioning that all the pause button changes also apply to Quick Restart, which now has a buffer window as well. This is generally the preferred way to pause buffer. This is because an extra pause input with Quick Restart doesn't unpause the game, which prevents accidental unpausing. Now for the change I probably see the most misinformation about. Celeste has a game feel mechanic where doing a horizontal dash close to a floor, whether you're above or below it, will snap you to that floor. While this is normally really useful, this also notably applied to spiked floors, which had some frustrating consequences. In particular, if you attempted to do a horizontal dash corner boost off of a wall that had a spiked floor on top, certain positions of a horizontal dash would result in a scenario where there is no possible frame for you to get a corner boost, instead getting snapped to the spiked floor and dying. As an example, on this next frame, I cannot get a corner boost, but on this upcoming frame, I get snapped to the floor and Madeline dies. This was somewhat commonly known as a dead pixel, and horizontal dash corner boost off spiked floors were rarely seen outside of ILs due to their inherent inconsistency. The beta patch fixes this problem, but it doesn't really solve the inherent inconsistency in my opinion. If this same scenario occurs on beta, Madeline survives, but she bumps into the wall as a result. This means Madeline cannot get the speed boost from this corner boost, instead only maintaining the speed she had previously during the dash. While this is better than dying, there are many situations still where this lack of speed boost makes or breaks a strat, and if you're playing optimally, you're going to be assuming that you're getting the speed boost. Unfortunately, fixing this would require overhauling how quarter boosts inherently work, so I suppose this is better than nothing. Off the top of my head, this change will only be useful for a couple of rooms, and I think this change has been causing a lot of placebo in terms of the consistency of horizontal corner boosts. This does have a pretty significant side effect though. You can now horizontal demo dash through 1 block wide tunnels of the spiked floor, which wasn't normally possible before. The places this actually saves time are really tight, but we might see this in IL someday in some level. The last significant change is that bumper boosts were made way more lenient. You can now hold away from a bumper during the freeze frames to get the speed boost from them, which makes bumper boosts, especially setupless dashless ones, way easier. This change is a huge deal for 6B, and especially the core A and B side, which have multiple really precise setupless bumper boosts that save a ton of time. I'll clarify that this only changes the timing window for bumper boosts, but not the positioning window. You still need to hit the bumper at the right spot for the boost, but you can hold away during freeze frames rather than needing to do so immediately. This change also applies to pufferfish and seeker explosions. Now for a bunch of minor things. None of these really directly impact the common speedrunning categories in my opinion, but they still felt worth documenting and mentioning. I'm not sure how to show this off, but the bottom kill zone of screens was extended by a few pixels. This change was likely to give a frame or two of leniency to casual players reacting to falling out of a screen, but the impact of this is really questionable since the difference is really small. Again, this is really difficult to demonstrate, but it actually makes rooms such as pillarless a bit easier for human players. They added a binocular in 3B. This isn't significant for speedruns, but a pretty significant change for bingo races, which are quite popular and commonly have binocular-related objectives. A bug with the birds in Farewell was fixed that caused them to fling you a different distance on entry compared to after a death. This had some really minor implications for speedrunning strats. I'll also mention that Farewell apparently saw some really minor level design changes, but many of them are inverted, and I'm unsure of how many of them even significantly impact a speedrun. It was too difficult to keep track of them, and I don't know the level very well, so if you're curious, you're just going to have to play the level yourself. You can't jump and talk on the same frame anymore, which had a few small time saves in Resort. I believe that's just about it for things I wanted to cover in this video, at least with regards to things that relate to the speedrun. If you want to try this beta patch yourself, and I believe you can only do this if you're playing on a Steam version of the game, you can go to your Steam library, right-click the game, and go to Properties, and then go to Betas and select either of these 1.3.3.0 betas. This patch will hopefully be going live soon as the new official version of Celeste, but until then, you're just going to have to settle with this beta build. The last question I'm sure people will have is how much time could be expected to be saved as a result of this patch. It's hard to say, but it also is going to depend on the legality of pause buffering. Without pause buffering being legal, easier diagonal demo dashes throughout an entire any percent run is potentially upwards of 5 seconds thanks to new strategies being found and more applications of them being useful. It's enough time to be significant, but it's not enough time for some of the more competitive world records to be changing hands anytime soon. Pause buffering, however, has potential to completely change the game, especially categories that aren't any percent. Depth's early key alone is a task-only skip that is possible with pause buffering, and it's a huge time save for any category that needs to get to Heart in 5A. Pause buffering things like second blocklist in 4A also means less runs killed to the trick and more runs on good pace out of Ridge, but you do also sacrifice a bit of time for that trade-off of consistency. At the end of the day, it's really hard to say how much time this patch is expected to save. That should just about cover everything, though. Again, if anything is inaccurate or I missed something worth mentioning, please point it out in the comments. As well, any questions are welcome as well. I check my notifications fairly regularly for people commenting on tasks I work on, and I usually answer everything I see. Thanks for watching, and I hope this was useful.